Hey y'all, Van Lufa here, watching and recapping the Derek Chauvin trial so you don't have to. Van's scrub of the day is a black scrub top with nursey stuff on it. Stethoscopes and all that good stuff. Okay, so let's get started. Cheers. Okay, today was day 6 of the Derek Chauvin trial. It's April 5th, 2021. Oh, some of the stuff I wrote a long time ago earlier today, so I'm going to have to go through it here. So there was a motion starting out the day. Matthew Frank submitted some of Derek Chauvin's body cams. The defense was asking if one of the videos that was submitted could run a little bit longer than they had showed, to show Derek Chauvin and Officer King talking about the store manager, talking about the counterfeit bill and where he was in his vehicle. The state thinks that it's a hearsay problem and a relevance problem. In regards to the video that was Exhibit 2034, the judge is going to allow it to be played. The Exhibit 2045, which is another video, the judge is saying is hearsay and they are not going to allow it. Nelson argued about that, and in the end, it was decided to be allowed. Then there was a hearing that was off audio and off video. Afterwards, I found out that it was what's called a Schwartz Hearing. And basically what a Schwartz Hearing is discussion in the case that there was potential juror misconduct. And apparently they determined that there was not. They just discussed other matters about who was testifying. Nelson just asked that they didn't have a ton of officers that come in and give their opinions of the use of force. The judge just reiterated he will not allow opinions. They just had a lot of discussion about not, having a million police officers in there, giving their opinions. Okay. So the first state's witness, who's state's witness number 20, was interviewed by Jerry Blackwell, and that was Dr. Bradford Langenfeld. He was the physician who provided care to George Floyd when he was sent to the hospital. He was actually the one that pronounced him dead. They just talked about his education and where he works. He started in emergency medicine in May of 2020. He was a resident at this time. They just talked about what his duties are as a resident and as an emergency medicine physician. He did state that he provided the majority of the medical care that night. He defined what cardiac arrest means. He got the text that came in at 8:50 for EMS, from EMS, and they explain what they're bringing into you. And then he mentioned that after all of this went down, he did see videos of the incident and then was able to see how everything went down. Paramedics gave him a report when they arrived. They did mention that he was in police custody at that time, but they did not mention anything about a drug overdose or a heart attack. The paramedics had told them about what they had done in the field. They talked a little bit about the use of epinephrine and sodium bicarb within a cardiac arrest situation. They also talked about that when he got to the hospital, he was in PEA, which is pulseless electrical activity. They talked about different shockable rhythms. PEA and asystole are not shockable rhythms. The physician noticed marks on his wrist afterwards from the handcuffs. And then they had a little discussion here about the H's and the T's. This is something that this is part of what's called ACLS, which is Advanced Cardiac Life Support. And basically what they do is they're doing the life-saving things such as drugs, chest compressions, airway, all of that. But then they address what are called the H's and T's because they have to find out why this patient went into arrest. And then they asked him if he had any theories as to why Mr. Floyd went into cardiac arrest. He ruled a few things out after doing an ultrasound of the abdomen and the chest. And maybe I should mention before I finish, I just kind of glossed over the H's and the T's. And think like there's hypoxia, hypovolemia, meaning dehydration, not enough volume. Some of the things with T's would be toxins. And I may have talked about that more in here, but basically things that started with H and T that could be possible reasons for cardiac arrest. The lawyer asked, did you consider toxins, specifically drugs? He said yes, but nothing that was given in report was mentioned about drugs, so he didn't really think it was related. So he didn't really spend a lot of time on that one. Hypoxia is one of the leading causes of PEA. And so he considered, maybe a situation of acidosis, but there was really no indication of that. So Mr. Floyd was pronounced dead within 30 minutes of arriving to the hospital and had been told that he'd been worked on for a previous 30 minutes in the field. In his opinion, the leading cause was hypoxia or asphyxia. They took a mid-morning break, of course they did. Upon cross-examination by Eric Nelson, he asks things that could cause hypoxia, such as drug use, specifically fentanyl and methamphetamines. He explained how Mr. Floyd had blood gases drawn, and he explained what that was. His carbon dioxide levels in the sample that they drew were high. His were over 100, and normal level for carbon dioxide is 35 to 45. He was asked if fentanyl could cause an increase in CO2 levels, and he said yes. They talked about how he was never given Narcan, either in the field or at the hospital. They talked about how narcotics can be, some people can give them or hide the narcotics intrarectally. Another possibility could be occlusion of the coronary artery, and he said yes. They talked about how a paramedic cannot announce death. They reiterated again that Narcan was not administered in this case. On redirect, the state said regarding Narcan, once a patient is in cardiac arrest, the administration of Narcan is of no benefit. So the fact that he wasn't given Narcan would be okay in this situation. He was in cardiac arrest the whole time, so it wouldn't have done anything. They went back to talking about the blood gases, the carbon dioxide. Having a high carbon dioxide was a weak evidence at the time for him, meaning it could have been caused by so many things that it just wasn't something that he focused on at that moment. Because he said that carbon dioxide would be expected to be high in a cardiac arrest. They asked, was there any indication that Floyd had been given drugs intrarectally? And he said no. Okay, state's witness number 21 is Madaria Arredondo. He is the chief of police of Minneapolis. Now, I know that I never interject my opinion in here because I shouldn't, because my opinion is not at all relevant to the facts of the case. However, I am going to interject my opinion just once. The officer Arredondo, who's the chief of police, I love him. loved him. He just came off as so kind and gentle, and I just loved him. Okay, so he is the highest ranking officer at the police department. He's 54 years old. He has a master's degree in criminal justice. He joined the MPD in 1989. He talked about the motto of the Minneapolis Police Department. He described his law enforcement training, he also made a comment that the training that they receive at the academy today is better than what he received back then. And then he talked about post training. Post stands for, or the standard, post, excuse me, it's late. He talked about what's called post, Peace Officers Standards of Training, which include defensive tactics, crisis intervention, procedural justice training. They did Exhibit 209, which is the sworn rank structure of the officers. And then he talked about all of his positions in the police force over the years. He asked how many times had he cuffed someone who is non-compliant, and he said, we do that on the regular. Also spoke that de-escalation is a regular part of the job. He was also a sergeant in internal affairs for 2 years when he investigated cases of employee misconduct. And then they asked, are some of these cases including excessive use of force? And he said yes. He has actually done those before. They discussed different ranks he had and different duties he had. He stated that currently there are 700 officers at the Minneapolis Police Department, and he just explained a little bit about how the department is organized. Exhibit 269 was a precinct map. Exhibit 268 was a map of the 3rd precinct and just showing the different sectors. He also worked for the Professional Standards Bureau at one time, and they do the training. He described the different types of calls of service that they receive. He did state that yearly they receive a couple of hundred of thousands of calls into the 911 dispatch. They talked about how the training takes place at the Special Operations Center. He explained the training of new hires and everything that they go through. Talked about pre-service and post-service training. So the pre-service training is everything that they receive before they actually get to be on their own, and post-training is kind of their yearly training that they receive. He also explained a little bit the FTO, or the field training officers, and that they do work with an FTO for 5 months when they're new. Talked about yearly and mandatory training. He participates in the training. He was asked if the officers receive a written copy of the policies. Yes, they do. Exhibit 207, there is a policy that states that officers have to know the policies and how to access them. They also have to sign a paper stating that they acknowledge that. Exhibit 274 was acknowledgement form for the policies and procedures. They shared a copy of Derek Chauvin's acknowledgement form. Exhibit 215 was the professional policing policy. And what that policy entails is treating people with dignity and respect. It talked about since bystanders now record videos on their cell phones, has there been any training on people recording? Yes. And he did state that bystanders do have the right to record as long as it does not obstruct what the officers are doing. Exhibit 273 was the public recording police activities policy, and that was instated in May of 2016. They talked about de-escalation, and the goal of de-escalation is a safe and peaceful outcome, and that was that took place in the late 90s or early 2000s was when that was put into place. The MPD obviously has a de-escalation policy. Exhibit 219 showed that policy. They kind of read through that. Basically, using de-escalation helps to minimize the use of force. They also just talked about, when it comes to the use of force, the considerations made if somebody is under the influence of drugs and alcohol. And then he stated that people react differently to being under the influence. They talked about a behavioral crisis and the triggering factors for that. And can a behavioral crisis be a barrier in compliance? Yes. Then they went to lunch. Exhibit 219 again, they read over the de-escalation policy. They discussed those tactics. They talked about what is called an EDP, which is an emotionally disturbed person. And that is what dispatch uses. They use that term. So when they dispatch a call out to police, they try to tell them that this call involves an EDP. Yearly, they receive about 4,500 EDP calls. Exhibit 231 is the crisis intervention policy. He gave the definition of crisis, talked about mental illness, substance abuse. He also gave the definition of crisis intervention, and that MPD officers should value safety and sanctity of life. He spoke about the officers' roles as first responders, gave training examples, such as they learn, about the ABCs, airway, breathing, circulation. They carry tourniquets with them. Another exhibit, 216, talked about the sanctity of life as the cornerstone of the use of force policy. It was implemented in 2016. Exhibit 217 was the use of force policy. And then he defined what force was and the circumstances when an officer can use force. Another thing it states in the policy is that it should be reasonable force and force that is logical. Typically for this type of call, which is, there was a counterfeit bill, the subject is not taken into custodial arrest. Their training in the use of force is both pre-service and post-service. Exhibit 276 was the MPD critical decision model. He explained that. He explained that the MPD trains in defensive tactics, and they are also trained on what their personal responsibility is once someone is in cuffs. The defensive tactic training takes place yearly. 525 of 20, there were neck restraints, and had neck restraints and chokeholds been taught by that time? Yes. Exhibit 224 was the use of restraints policy. A chokehold is considered a deadly force. So is a neck restraint, and there are various types of deadly forces. The neck restraint is used in an attempt to control but not render them unconscious, using light to moderate pressure. He received a call on 5/25/20 at around 9 p.m. He received it from the deputy chief about the incident. He contacted the BCA himself just for a pending critical incident. He also knew that Mr. Floyd was in grave condition, so he just wanted to get the ball rolling. He also at that time contacted the Minneapolis mayor and let them know what was going on. And then he left the house and went to the city hall in anticipation of the critical incident taking place. He reviewed the public safety videos at the scene after learning that Mr. Floyd had died. Around midnight that night, he found out about the bystander video and watched it. Exhibit 17 was the famous image of Chauvin on the neck. He was asked, "Do you agree he followed the de-escalation policy?" He said, "I absolutely do not agree." "How so?" He said, "That wasn't de-escalation, it was contrary to de-escalation." They said, "Is this a trained defensive tactic?" He said, "It is not." "Is this a neck restraint?" He said, "Yes, but it does not appear that it is light or moderate pressure." "Does this type of restraint violate department policy?" "Yes, it does." He discussed how force has to be objectively reasonable, and it was not. When should it be stopped? He said it should have been stopped when Mr. Floyd stopped resisting, and certainly when he voiced distress. He said, did you see, in the footage, did you see signs of him being in distress? And he said, yes. The officers were not able to find a pulse, and the officers did not attempt medical training, and that they violated the policy in terms of rendering aid. On cross-examination, of course, Eric, he has to get his little digs in. That's what he does. He says to the highest ranking member of the police department, as police chief, you aren't on the street day-to-day arresting people, are you? He said no. When was the last time you arrested a suspect? He said it had been many years. They discussed more training, how he goes and gets training from other places. They reviewed policies. Again, the Exhibit 216, the use of force policy. And they talked about how reasonableness applies when it comes to use of force. They discuss active aggression versus active resistance. The difference between being detained and being arrested. He asked if walking up to a car, like for a traffic stop or for anything else, is a dangerous situation. He said it can be. They went over the use of force policy again. He said there are limitations in the use of force. It's different in every case. But de-escalation is advisable when it's safe and feasible. And Eric asked, can use of force be a de-escalation tactic? He said sometimes. They discussed again, per policy, it does state that officers need to render medical aid as soon as practical. Then they talked about the maximal restraint techniques. Exhibit 225 talked about the hobble, which is a restraint device used in a combative person. And that is where they have a cord attaching their legs, and the cord is attached to their waist. If at any time that is used, a supervisor must be called to the scene, and they cannot be transported in that position. Policies are situationally dependent, yes. Then Exhibit 231 was a crisis intervention policy. He read what the definition was. They do have training and classes on how to deal with crowd control. Exhibit 1008 was a 5-second clip of King's body cam and a voice that says, we've got an ambulance coming. Then there was the mid-afternoon break, because of course there was a break. On continuation of cross-examination, they talked about the neck restraint policy. Exhibit 224, the differences between a chokehold and a neck restraint. The chokehold is generally from the front. It is a deadly force. Neck restraint is compressing one or both sides of the neck without pressure to the trachea, using light to moderate pressure. And Eric reminded him that he is not qualified to speak on the amount of force that was used, and he agreed. First, I think they asked him if he had a degree in physics, so that therefore he wouldn't be an expert in that. They just talked about neck restraints. There's conscious neck restraints and unconscious neck restraints. Both are in the policy. He agreed that the conscious neck restraint was used. And what he took issue with was the amount of time that he was on the neck. And Eric said, but someone who is handcuffed is not necessarily threatless, right? And he said, yes. Exhibit 1018 was a clip of the bystander video. And then he asked him if he had ever heard of camera perspective bias, and he had not. Exhibit 1019 was body cam footage of Officer King. Exhibit 1020 was side-by-side videos of the bystander video, which is, from the front there, we've all seen it. And then side-by-side videos of the bystander video and the cam footage video. Eric said, "Would you agree from the bystander video that Chauvin's knee was on the neck?" He said yes. He's asked, from the body cam footage, would you agree the knee appeared to be on the shoulder blade? He said yes. Upon redirect, the lawyer wanted to say that the ambulance had already arrived at the time that that video took place, and that the knee was on the neck until the time that they had just showed, and he said yes. They showed a picture again of Chauvin on the neck, and he said, the neck restraint policy, do you agree that it is not a trained MPD neck restraint? He said yes. He talked about other photos or other little clips that they showed of videos. He said, did you see Floyd actively resisting? No. Was he being actively aggressive? No. He did some more questioning about the hobble, which is the maximal restraint technique. He reiterated that if it's used, they need to be placed in the side recovery position. If left prone and cuffed for too long, there is a risk of positional asphyxia. They showed the picture of Chauvin again, the famous picture. And he asked, is one way to de-escalate the crowd from seeing something shocking stopping doing the something shocking? And he said yes. Again, on cross-examination, they talked about the policy for the maximal restraint techniques, reiterating that patients should be placed on their side when it's possible, and he said yes. Redirect, sometimes a person has to be held longer, yes, but it has to be done safely, yes. State's witness, number 22, was Katie Blackwell. She is the inspector of the 5th precinct for the MPD. Prior, she was the commander of the training division. She talked about her education. She is also in the National Guard. She has been for 23 years. She was deployed in the past. She's been at the police department since 1999. She talked about her different positions over the years and her role at the training center. She does know Derek Chauvin. She has known him for almost 20 years. She talked about her training within the MPD. She talked about the training center location and who staffs it. She talked about pre-service training. Do trainers receive the same training? Yes, they do. And they talked about the importance of keeping records of training. Exhibit 203 was Chauvin's training records. Records are retained for 7 years. They talked about annual in-service training, defensive tactics are taken yearly. Yes, they are. Exhibit 275 was the sign-in roster from a particular yearly training. He had signed it and said that he had received the training. They showed his training records again. He had all the needed training. By the way, take a shot whenever I say the word training, and then have your phone handy. They talked about yearly medical training. She explained what they teach him. They also talked about a positional asphyxia and when is necessary to render medical aid. They also talked about the critical decision model again. At this point, we've all seen it and can probably speak to it. They talked about how the rules of the policies apply to everyone. They showed the pic of Chauvin again. You should know by now, it's Exhibit 17. So just remember that. She saw the picture. He asked her, is this a trained technique? It is not. On cross-examination by Eric Nelson, he talked about in-service training again. Do they get variable classes? Yes. The continuing education is given by multiple trainers? Yes. And that was it. That is our day summed up. Again, lots of interesting information. Again, just like Friday, the defense has taken a little blow, I think. But anyway, that is my recap, you guys. Thank you so much for watching. I'll do it again tomorrow. I've got a very, very, very busy week scheduled, so with out-of-town visitors and everything, so I'm going to do my best. But thank you guys so much for watching, and I'll see you on the next one. Bye.